Week after week, Ukraine has been hitting Russia where it hurts. We don't mean causing casualties by the thousands on the battlefield, though that certainly is happening. We also don't mean that Ukraine is destroying armor and air defenses in enormous numbers, though that is happening too. We're talking about Ukraine's true masterstroke: unrelenting strikes against Russia's oil refineries. Those strikes have paid off, cutting Russia's refining capacity so substantially that Vladimir Putin is getting desperate. Russia's president has no other option. Putin has gone crawling to Belarus for help, as Ukraine took everything from Russia. And when we say everything, we really mean it. On October 1st, the Kyiv Post published an article in which it pointed out that Ukraine's strikes against Russia's oil refineries have now taken a staggering 38% of Russia's refining capacity. That's a third of Russia's refining gone, vanished into thin air, at least until Russia can manage to fix the damage that Ukraine is causing. That's easier said than done. Ukraine has been hitting Russia's refineries since 2024, though it didn't cause this sheer scale of problems initially. The difference now is that Ukraine has evolved its strategy. It doesn't just hit a refinery in isolation and then leave it until Russia repairs it. Ukraine strikes a refinery, then it strikes again and again, giving Russia no chance to get the facility up and running again. Repairs happen slowly, but by the time they're done, something else in the refinery has been destroyed and requires fixing. Plus, the components needed for those repairs are in short supply as a result of Western sanctions. And it's thanks to this combination of sanctions and Ukraine's strategy that Russia now finds itself having lost 38% of its refining capacity and, more than likely, will lose even more as the war drags on. The Kyiv Post provides the numbers, courtesy of the market intelligence agency Ciala. Ukraine's strikes have managed to take out 338,000 tons of Russian oil refining per day completely offline. That's led to Russia's collective output of gasoline dropping by about 1 million tons, which is wreaking havoc on the country's domestic market. Right now, the Kyiv Post reports Russia is 20% short of its domestic gasoline market's demand, which is causing major problems for Putin's efforts to keep his people under control. After all, Putin lies and manipulates to maintain control. He withholds information. He claims that Russia is doing far better than it is against Ukraine and that his great enemy is on the verge of capitulating. It gets a lot more difficult to make those sorts of claims when your citizens are queuing for hours just for a chance to get their hands on gasoline that used to flow freely. And with each passing day, Russia's gasoline crisis seems to deepen. Writing for Forbes on September 29th, David Hambling covers the crisis in detail. He says that a shortage that started with some of Russia's outlying and, in Putin's mind, less important regions has worsened to the point where gasoline shortages are now being felt across the country. Rising prices, long queues, rationing, and in some cases, pumps running dry are becoming part of life in Russia, Hambling writes, showcasing how Ukraine has created a new normal for the everyday Russian that proves every word Putin says about how the war is going is a lie. Prices are a particular problem. Hambling says that buyers at the pumps are now paying up to $4.52 per gallon of gasoline in some regions, which is veering uncomfortably close to double Russia's officially claimed average price of $2.66. We see the deception in action. Russia claims one price, knowing that its people are paying for more. Euromaidan Press, in an October 1st report, adds that price increases have been massive since the beginning of 2025. Between January and today, wholesale gasoline prices have jumped by more than 40%, with AI-92-grade gasoline selling at $880 per ton, while a ton of AI-95 retails for $850. Of course, those higher prices are being passed on to the consumer, assuming gas stations are even able to get their hands on increasingly expensive gasoline. It's in his desperate search for a solution to these major problems that Putin has gone crawling to Belarus. But we'll cover that later in the video. Coming back to the problems at the pumps, Euromaidan Press adds that shortages are so bad that restrictions are in place in several regions. Over 20 of those regions face shortages, the outlet claims. Crimea, which Russia occupied, has placed a limit of 30 liters, or about 6.5 gallons per purchase per customer. Other regions have even tighter restrictions, with some going as low as 10 liters. That's just over 2.5 gallons. For context, an average sedan requires between 12 and 16 gallons for a full tank, meaning the best the average Russian can hope for in some of these affected regions is half a tank before they're moved along. Hambling adds to this. He says that some of Russia's regional chains have restricted not just how much gasoline customers can buy, but also which customers can buy in the first place. One regional chain is now reportedly only selling to commercial customers with fleet fuel cards, while another flipped the idea and is no longer selling to customers with fuel cards, Hambling says. These aren't moves made by companies that are in good health. This is panic. It's gasoline chains doing whatever they can think of to stretch their dwindling supplies of their chief product, all as Ukraine's strikes cause further restrictions that will hit these companies harder in the future. Gas station closures are becoming increasingly common. Parents can't even pick up their children from school in some regions. And despite Russia's leadership doing its best to convince the public that nothing is untoward, going as far as to ban footage of drone strikes on refineries from being shared, Putin has to face the reality of Russia's situation. These shortages tell Russia's people that bad things are happening. One of the world's most oil-rich nations is running out of gasoline, and that can only be happening for one reason: Ukraine is destroying Russia's refineries. In an October 1st report, the Moscow Times puts it bluntly. Putin can't hide Russia's gasoline crisis, the headline blares. It points out that many of the head honchos in Russia's fuel industry are trying to frame what is happening as a temporary period of shortage that will be resolved soon. But it isn't. The Moscow Times says these shortages aren't a wartime inconvenience, they're a warning flare, a massive red flag that is showing the average Russian that massive cracks are forming in the wartime economy Putin has created to sustain a special military operation that has lasted years when it was supposed to be over in days. Meanwhile, Russia is sinking deeper into recession. VEB, the state-owned development bank that bankrolls major government projects, now forecasts GDP contracting by 0.6% for 2 straight quarters, a textbook technical recession, the Moscow Times reports. Think about what that means in the context of the gasoline price increases we mentioned earlier. A contracting economy means less money to go around for a general public that is already being squeezed of every last ruble when buying food and now gasoline. Something has to give, and it may just end up being Putin's grasp on leadership. Of course, Putin doesn't want to relinquish the presidency, and in his desperation, he has gone crawling to a nation that for so long has appeared to serve as a puppet state for Russia: Belarus. Belarus and Russia have maintained a steady, though at times contentious, relationship when it comes to energy. It was only in 2010 that Russia was cutting Belarus off from gas supplies due to debts, so the relationship between the two nations has never quite been as rosy as it would seem, given Belarus's role in facilitating Putin's Ukraine invasion. However, with Russia struggling, Belarus has gone from a nation that Putin can influence to one that he's turning to in order to rescue Russia. There's a problem with this approach. Belarus may be willing to help Russia, but it may not be able. Euromaidan Press reports that September 30th saw the Eurasian Economic Commission, or EEC, of which Russia and Belarus are members, temporarily suspend import duties on all fuel. This is obviously a move designed to help Russia in its moment of need, as it clears the way for Russia to start buying refined oil products in droves from Belarus without having to pay any form of import tax. And Russia needs that ability. Euromaidan Press says that Ukraine's refinery strikes have put Russia in a position where it will need 9 months to resolve its supposedly temporary fuel crisis. That assumes that Ukraine doesn't take out any more of Russia's refining capacity, which is a pretty big assumption to make given how well this strategy is working for Ukraine. Back to the EEC's suspension that has put Russia in the position where it's banned fuel exports from other nations while allowing it to prepare for mass imports of fuel from its much smaller neighbors. It's as one-sided as an agreement can be, and it's to Belarus that Putin came calling. Initially, Belarus wasn't especially receptive. When import taxes were in place, Russia was offering Belarus less than $1,000 per ton of gasoline. Belarus could get between $1,300 and $1,900 per ton on the international market, so it wasn't willing to sell anywhere near what Putin wanted or needed to deal with Russia's refined oil crisis. In August, Euromaidan Press says Belarus even announced that it would restrict its fuel supplies to Russia. Except it didn't actually seem to do that. Between July and September, Belarus has sold 36% more petroleum products to Russia via the St. Petersburg exchange than it did during the same period in 2024. That amounts to 97,000 tons of petroleum products. Of those products, the two most important to Russia are gasoline and diesel. Sales of both by Belarus to Russia skyrocketed in September. Belarus sold 168% more gasoline to Russia in September than it did in August, with diesel sales increasing by a smaller, though still impressive, 83%. So all signs now point to Belarus being on board with selling gasoline and diesel to help Russia. Putin's begging and suspension of import tariffs must have worked. However, we said earlier that Belarus may be willing to sell more petroleum products to Russia, but it may not be able. The reason is that Belarus relies heavily on its own refineries to ensure it meets its own domestic demand for gasoline. Euromaidan Press outlines why there is such a problem. Belarusian refineries have an annual production capacity of only 3 to 4 million tons of gasoline, with 2 million tons consumed domestically, while Russia consumes 3 million tons of gasoline in 1 month alone, the outlet says. You likely see the problem. Anywhere between half and 2/3 of Belarus's gasoline production is already tied up in its domestic market. That leaves between 1 and 2 million tons of gasoline left over for the entire year. Those numbers are fine for a small nation when it isn't under pressure to produce more. Belarus handles its own gasoline needs and has a surplus to sell to boost its economy. However, that annual surplus isn't even enough to cover a single month of Russia's gasoline consumption, especially at a time when Russia is using more gasoline than ever before due to the war. Putin is begging for scraps. And though Belarus is willing to drop those scraps from the table, they're nowhere near enough to sustain Russia's massive gasoline needs. Belarus does have another idea for how it could help Russia out. On September 26, Reuters reported that Belarus has suggested that it may be able to supply nuclear energy to the occupied regions of Ukraine. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko put the idea to Putin when the two met for talks in the Kremlin earlier in September. If a decision is made, we will immediately begin building a new power unit or a new station if there is a need for electricity in Western Russia and in the liberated regions, Lukashenko announced following the meeting. That's helpful to an extent. Putin can use any help he can get when it comes to supplying any sort of power to the occupied regions of Ukraine. However, this offer doesn't do much to help Russia with its gasoline crisis. Putin can't even claim that Belarus's nuclear energy will replace gasoline-derived energy. Russia generates the majority of its electricity using gas and coal, with the rest coming from renewables. Gasoline doesn't even enter the picture, meaning Lukashenko is offering Putin a bunch of oranges when what he really needs is more apples. Again, we come back to the point we made earlier. Belarus may be willing, but it isn't able. No matter how much Putin begs, Belarus can only offer what amounts to a band-aid for the gaping wound that is Russia's gasoline crisis right now. And Belarus isn't going to offer much more than that. Lukashenko is smart enough to know that he can't hurt his own people to serve Putin's needs, whether he wants to or not. Even if the Belarusian president made the terrible decision to sell all of the gasoline his country produces to Russia, that would still only be enough to cover a month or so of Russia's consumption. Putin has to know this, which only goes to show the depths of his desperation. Even the small amount of gasoline Belarus can provide is better than nothing, as Russia deals with worsening shortages thanks to Ukraine's strikes. And that leads us to what the future may hold for Russia, and it doesn't look good. Russia's refined oil situation isn't going to get better because Ukraine's strikes are only becoming more frequent and intense. On August 28th, Ukraine broke its record for taking Russia's refining offline, Reuters reports. Ukraine's drone strikes took an estimated 3.1 million tons of Russia's refining offline in that month, leading to a total of 6.4 million idle tons when accounting for planned maintenance. That was 65% higher than the previous estimates, and Putin would have hoped that it couldn't get any worse from there. It could, and it did. The Kyiv Post says that September's outages were so high that they surpassed the record-breaking August. Breaking things down into daily numbers, September's offline refining exceeded the 206,000 tons per day seen in August. Russia's worst months beyond that also don't even come close. May 2022 saw 196,000 tons per day of Russian refining go offline. May 2020 was another past high point, though that was only 164,000 tons per day. Records are being broken, and they're not the kinds of records that Putin wants to see. All of this tells us one thing: Ukraine has found a winning strategy and is sticking to it. There's absolutely no reason to believe that Ukraine is suddenly going to stop its refinery strikes now that Russia is dealing with a gasoline crisis. It's also hit more than 24 of Russia's major refineries since the beginning of August, the Kyiv Post says. About 70% of the outages reported by these refineries were caused by Ukraine's drones, and Russia doesn't seem capable of doing anything about these types of strikes. That's Putin's major problem. Russia has lost 1,224 of its air defense systems since Putin launched his invasion, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. The sheer scale of those losses creates a situation where Russia's domestic defenses are stretched thin. If Putin doesn't move air defenses from inside Russia into Ukraine, then Ukraine can do more damage to his invading forces. But by moving those air defenses, Putin creates gaps that Ukraine can exploit with its long-range drones. Exploit is exactly what it's going to do. Ukraine is already building millions of drones annually. According to the Atlantic Council, Ukraine's current annual total of 5 million could be doubled with Western funding, which will give Ukraine enough drones to completely overwhelm Russia's air defenses. And wouldn't you just know it? On October 1st, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced a new agreement with Ukraine that will see the European Union allocate 2 billion euros, or around $2.35 billion, to Ukraine for drone production. Europe knows that Ukraine is onto a winning strategy, and with that funding, Ukraine can build even more of the long-range drones that have forced Putin to go to Belarus with the Russian cap in his hands. That's the big reality check for Russia's leader. The crisis he faces right now isn't the end point of Ukraine's strategy, it's just the beginning. With more drones being built than ever before, Ukraine's refinery strikes are likely to grow more frequent and powerful. In a few months, 38% of Russia's refining capacity being offline may grow to 50%, maybe more. The Belarusian band-aid is already nowhere near enough to solve the problem, and it will end up being a non-factor if Ukraine simply keeps on doing what it's doing. As Russia grapples with its fuel crisis, Ukraine's deep strikes also impact the country's economy. That's according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which claims that Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory have cost Putin more than $74 billion since January 2025. That amounts to about 4% of Russia's annual gross domestic product, or GDP. That may not seem like much in percentage terms, but it's a substantial loss for a country that's already grappling with a burgeoning economic crisis. So no, Ukraine's drone strikes aren't going to stop. They're getting too many good results for Ukraine, so Putin can't hang on to any sort of hope that Ukraine is going to relent. The Russian fuel crisis, which is already going to take at least 9 months to fix, is only going to get worse. What we may be seeing here is the slow death of one of the world's energy superpowers in real time. After all, Russia is built on a foundation of oil and gas sales. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies says that oil and gas revenues account for about 20% of Russia's GDP and up to 50% of its total federal budget revenues during any given year. The more Ukraine attacks Russia's refineries and other energy infrastructure, the more these numbers are going to drop. After all, Russia can't sell a product that it's producing in such limited quantities that it isn't even able to serve its domestic market. Putin's desperate plea to Belarus hasn't gone unheard, but it's a plea that will make no difference given how low Belarus's gasoline output is. Putin has only one way out of the crisis. He has to end the Ukraine war before the Ukraine war ends him. Russia categorically failed to take Pokrovsk during the summer offensive. Frankly, it should have learned its lesson when the vital logistical hub held strong and all of the minor gains Russia made around the city started to be reversed. But of course, Vladimir Putin never learns lessons. Rather than withdrawing from Pokrovsk, he has ordered his depleted troops to continue their assaults. And in doing so, Putin is creating a bloodbath. Russia's last-ditch assault on Pokrovsk has walked straight into Ukraine's meat grinder, meaning more dead Russian soldiers and the continuation of a defensive strategy that has stopped Russia in its tracks. On September 30th, Euromaidan Press reported that Ukraine had spent the previous few days expanding its control in the Pokrovsk region by counterattacking in several key positions. The Ukrainian goal is simple. After unfortunately allowing Russia to occupy several small settlements around Pokrovsk that created the potential for encirclement, Ukraine is undoing the damage. And in doing so, Ukraine is cutting off the remaining Russian troops from reinforcements, creating pockets of soldiers that have no way to fight back and no means of escape. That's the most important part of the strategy for Ukraine. Throughout the summer, Russia's forces exhausted themselves by taking these small settlements. Depleted and waiting for reinforcements, they haven't been able to prevent Ukraine from encircling them, trapping them in regions they thought they'd successfully occupied. Russia is trying to send reinforcements, of course, but Ukraine's own encirclement strategy means that those reinforcements are doing little more than charging headlong into a meat grinder that chews them up and spits them out long before they get anywhere near the exhausted forces that Ukraine has trapped so successfully. The reinforcements are firmly in Ukraine's crossfire, Euromaidan Press reports. As for the trapped troops, they're running out of time. Much of the fighting focuses on Dobropilya, Euromaidan Press says. Though not as important as Pokrovsk, Dobropilya is a strategically important town because it provides access to a vital highway and ultimately would aid Russia in its main objective of taking Pokrovsk. However, September has been a bad month for Russia in Dobropilya. By September 12th, Al Jazeera was reporting that Russia was gunning for Dobropilya, but it was losing more ground than it was gaining. The outlet said that the Ukrainian army's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, had claimed that Russia has captured about 5.21 square miles in the region, only to lose 10 square miles it had previously occupied. That sort of ratio is unsustainable for Russia. It's also proof that the traps Ukraine is springing on Russia's forces in the region are working. By September 22nd, UKR Inform said that Russia was continuing to launch assaults in Dobropilya, but they were all collapsing. Ukraine's counter-offensives were taking their toll. Plus, the encirclement strategy was doing its job in terms of cutting off Russia's logistics and preventing reinforcements from making their way into the region. Viktor Trahubov, who is a spokesperson for the Dnipro Operational Strategic Group of Troops, outlined why Russia has started to fail in Dobropilya. They infiltrated in small groups through the first line of Ukrainian defense, and then combined these small groups with a larger group, occupied positions and tried to break through. They then tried to fortify what they had already captured and bring in reinforcements, Trahubov explained. At some point at this stage, they began to fail. Thanks to effective countermeasures, we began to strike them, which began to destroy their logistics, and they began to gradually lose their positions. This continues to this day. This statement highlights the strategy Russia used throughout the summer. Rather than relying on large, mechanized assault groups that attack in waves to wear Ukraine's defenses down, Russia is now sending small units to infiltrate. These units, which are often just a few dozen soldiers large, are supposed to create small gaps in Ukraine's defenses before converging into a larger force that can fortify and open up larger gaps for future assaults. Only that's not what's been happening. The small units manage to break through, only for Ukraine to close the gaps they create and trap them in the territory that they occupy. It's a brilliant form of counterattack, and it's going to force Putin and his cronies back to the drawing board if they're to have any chance of taking Dobropilya, never mind Pokrovsk. This brings us back to Euromaidan Press's September 30th report. The outlet says that Russia, growing increasingly desperate in Dobropilya, is clinging to the settlement that may allow it to turn the tide, Novotoretska. Only a few weeks ago, Russia held this settlement and was preparing to use it as a launchpad for a multi-angle assault on Pokrovsk. Ukraine reversed that situation with a counterattack. However, Novotoretska hasn't been fully liberated by Ukraine. It occupies what Euromaidan Press calls a grey zone, in which Ukraine controls a handful of houses in the settlement. The rest of the town is being patrolled by Ukraine's drones, which are seeking out and destroying any Russian troops they find. Still, this lack of total Ukrainian control has led Russia to believe there's a chance it could retake Novotoretska. But to do that, it needs to find a way to break through Ukraine's increasingly dense swarm of drones in the settlement. Getting the operators is Russia's only chance, but for that to happen, dozens, if not hundreds of soldiers will have to die. Putin is prepared to make that sacrifice. He has sent fresh reinforcements to Novotoretska to aid in the push. However, with so much to lose for what is a fairly small gain, the question has to be asked: why is Russia trying to complete this desperate, last-gasp push? Simple, it's all about the encircled troops we mentioned earlier. Euromaidan Press says that recapturing Novotoretska is the only way Russia sees to potentially reconnect with the beleaguered soldiers that Ukraine has trapped throughout Dobropilya. Those soldiers are being assaulted whenever they're brave enough to raise their heads, leading them to do little more than hunkering down as they hope for reinforcements to arrive. On September 26th, United 24 media reported on comments Syrskyi made that reveal how well Ukraine has pulled off this entrapment strategy and what it means for Russia's Pokrovsk-focused offensives. Syrskyi uses the example of a predicted Russian assault close to the Kazany-Torets River. Ukraine's response to that assault showcases what it's doing in Dobropilya and throughout the Pokrovsk region. Anticipating such a development, we redeployed a number of military units. The plan was to cut the enemy grouping along the barrier line, the Kazany-Torets River, Syrskyi said. Thus, the enemy units that had advanced in depth found themselves in a kind of bag. At the same time, we closed that line with actions by our air assault forces units on converging axes from the north and south. The enemy ended up trapped. Its destruction is now actually underway. That's Ukraine's counteroffensive strategy in a nutshell, and it's working like a charm in Dobropilya. To find out how well it's working, check out our video where we cover the cauldrons of Russian troops Ukraine has created in Dobropilya. There are multiple cauldrons, and all are cut off from one another and from any incoming reinforcements. This is the situation into which Russia is trying to send fresh troops to Novotoretska. However, those new Russian soldiers end up facing a terrifying reality check as they attempt their assaults. Ukraine expertly covers every potential approach to the trapped pockets of Russian soldiers. Drones patrol constantly, watching for any signs of Russian movement on these approaches. Russia's forces are being watched constantly. Ukraine knows where they are, and it knows what routes they will take, and it knows what routes they will have to take if they're to stand any chance of joining up with their comrades. As soon as any of the reinforcements are brave or stupid enough to attempt an advance, Ukraine is on them. Drones descend and those advancing soldiers get eliminated long before they make it to the combat lines Ukraine has created. As has so often been the case during the war, it's a meat grinder in action. Putin is stuck when it comes to the decisions he makes. Attempting to take Pokrovsk and Dobropilya has to happen. These are Putin's goals and he isn't going to stop pursuing them. However, Ukraine's entrapment strategy has been so well executed that Russia's approach of using smaller units just isn't working anymore. There are no more gaps to exploit, only approaches that Ukraine monitors and has turned into kill zones for Russia's forces. The pockets of troops near Novotoretska may be trapped, but it's the reinforcements sent to save them who are dying. The only progress Russia has been able to make is into a trench fortification close to Novotoretska. Even that offers little solace. Some of Russia's reinforcements may be able to make it to that trench, but from there they have no options. The approaches to the pockets they're trying to reach are shut off, and there's no chance of escaping the trench without facing overwhelming Ukrainian drone strikes, Euromaidan Press reports. It may seem strange to talk about trenches in the context of a 21st century war. However, both Russia and Ukraine have been using them extensively when fortifying. Le Monde highlighted this back in September 2023, noting that trench warfare had made a comeback in the Ukraine war. It noted that Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, which ultimately ended in failure, made heavy use of trenches because the country was forced to rely on infantry to make territorial gains. The same goes for Russia, which has failed to establish aerial dominance and is thus using trenches to help its troops make creeping advances. The problem with this approach for both sides is the same problem that existed when trench warfare reached its apex during World War I. There is always a no man's land between the two sides' trenches. During World War I, that region would be pelted regularly by artillery, making any charge across almost suicidal. In Ukraine, the artillery is still there, but the real danger outside those trenches is the hordes of drones that awaits anybody who climbs out. Those drones don't just occupy the no man's zone, hunting down anybody they find, but they also launch direct attacks on the trenches themselves, the Atlantic Council said in July. Ukraine has amassed aerial and ground-based drones to assault the trenches, which only highlights how a handful of Russian troops making it to a trench near Novotoretsk doesn't really mean anything when it comes to trying to reinforce the trapped pockets of troops. So the meat grinder is in place. Russia's last-gasp attack on Novotoretsk isn't working. Instead, Russia's forces are coming up against hordes of drones that shred them to pieces long before they can reach their comrades. You could argue that this is something of a stalemate. However, it's a stalemate that works entirely in Ukraine's favor. Russia's reinforcements are kept at bay while the trapped soldiers are whittled away. Eventually, grey zones like Novotoretsk will be fully liberated, and Russia will have lost even more territory than it previously gained. Worst of all, it will end up losing more soldiers in the process than had occupied that territory to begin with. Now that the situation is so dire for Russia in Dobropelia, the next question to ask is what comes next. This is an easy question to answer from a Russian perspective. As we explained earlier, Putin isn't going to withdraw his forces from the Pokrovsk region. Russia's leader wants that city, badly. Even when his troops are being pushed back, he's going to keep ordering assaults. The death and destruction caused by Ukraine's meat grinder will all be worth it to Putin if it means Russia eventually takes Pokrovsk. That city, Putin believes, is the key to taking the entire Donetsk region. Pokrovsk is just 20 kilometers, or about 12.4 miles, away from the Donetsk administrative border. That's enough for Putin, as reaching that border means that Russia essentially takes Donetsk. So Russia's assaults will keep coming, even though it has trapped troops and reinforcements dying in droves. It's Ukraine's response that will really determine what happens next in Dobropelia and, by extension, Pokrovsk. One thing that we know for sure is that Alexander Syrskyi is making it a point to spend a lot more time in the Pokrovsk and Dobropelia sectors. We saw that on September 12th when UNN reported that the Ukraine Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief had visited the sectors to discuss the operational situation and provide instructions for the troops stationed there. That visit appears to have revealed to Syrskyi that his presence in this region is vital, which is why he's going to take personal command of operations in Pokrovsk and Dobropelia. At least that's according to Euromaidan Press, which says, he frequently gathers his corps commanders together to discuss and plan out the next steps, react to Russian movements, and ensure his forces on the ground have everything they need to accomplish their missions. Syrskyi isn't going to allow the same type of oversight in command that allowed Russia to make progress toward Pokrovsk during the early part of the summer offensive again. Now every Russian assault will be met with a response that cancels the assault out almost immediately. But beyond maintaining the new status quo in and around Dobropelia, Syrskyi and his commander corps have turned their attention to new counterattacks. Next on the agenda is the region of Volodymyrivka. The settlement itself is under Ukraine's control, and it has been for a while. On August 25th, the Institute for the Study of War mentioned Volodymyrivka in one of its daily campaign assessments. Ukraine seized the settlement the day prior, liberating it from Russian control in yet another of Ukraine's late August counterattacks in the Pokrovsk sector. That retake was part of Ukraine's efforts to prevent Russia from expanding the salient it had created in the Pokrovsk direction during August. It worked. The salient broke down, leading to yet more entrapment of Russian troops, and Volodymyrivka went from being another potential launch pad for a Pokrovsk assault into a base from which Ukraine could launch further counterattacks. That's precisely what Ukraine intends to do now it has Volodymyrivka under control. Under Syrskyi's command, Euromaidan Press reports, Ukraine will turn its attention to settlements near Volodymyrivka. The idea here is to create another impenetrable wall to prevent Russian reinforcements from reaching the pockets of trapped soldiers deeper in Dobropelia. Beyond creating this barrier, Ukraine also hopes to consolidate the grey zones, such as Novotoretsk, so it can truly liberate these settlements. However, in addition to all of this, taking the area southwest of Volodymyrivka allows Ukraine to do something vital: take the high ground near Dobropelia. Euromaidan Press explains, stating, "If we look at the topographic map, we will see that by advancing to the southeast and strengthening their positions there, Ukrainians will effectively seize control of the entire high ground. In turn, this would secure the flank of their clearing operation making its way south and deny the Russians any chance to counterattack from above. So Ukraine is turning its brilliant defense into opportunities to counterattack and take territory. However, Syrskyi also recognizes that Ukraine's resurgent Pokrovsk-based forces have another challenge to overcome in the form of Russia's 155th Marine Brigade. That brigade, Euromaidan Press says, was responsible for the massacre in Bucha that claimed the lives of more than 1,000 people, many of whom were civilians, before Ukraine liberated the town at the end of March 2022. This is a notorious and some would say elite brigade of soldiers that is among Putin's favorites, and that brigade joins all of the rest of Russia's available Marines, including those in its 61st Naval Infantry Brigade. David Axe reported in his Trench Art column on September 27th. There are now 5 Marine units operating in the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya sectors, Axe says, so Ukraine has to create a strategy for dealing with them. Part of this strategy is already in place. The reinforcements Putin is trying to send to his trapped pockets of soldiers include Marines, so some of these elite soldiers are already being taken out. However, Putin will likely want to use the 155th Marine Brigade to take as much territory as possible. Ukraine can't allow that to happen, with Syrskyi now operating in the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya regions along with the Azov Corps that aided in the Pokrovsk counterattack seen in August. These Marines will likely end up being neutralized. Ukraine will be aided by the fact that the 155th Marine Brigade is a shadow of the version that wrought so much havoc in Bucha. The New Voice of Ukraine said in October 2024 that this brigade had lost 2,400 soldiers since the fall of 2022, amounting to about 80% of its total forces. Putin will have replenished the brigade with new soldiers, of course, but these new Marines are less experienced and perhaps less capable than the original butchers of Bucha. The 155th Marine Brigade is still dangerous. Its classification as one of Russia's elite brigades hasn't changed. However, its complexion is different, and that may make Ukraine's job of countering it just a little bit easier. So both sides have their strategies in play. Ukraine's strategy seems to be the better of the two. What this likely means is that more casualties lie in the future for Russia's forces. Ukraine's drone operators are working day and night to ensure the reinforcements Putin is sending to Pokrovsk get cut down, Euromaidan Press reports. When Ukraine secures the high ground near Volodymyrivka, even more problems will emerge for the Russian reinforcements. Anyone who manages to make it through Ukraine's layer of drones will then face the prospect of being ambushed from up high by Ukrainian artillery and soldiers. The odds are that Ukraine's strategy will only add to a 2025 that has seen Russia lose a tremendous number of troops to the Ukraine war meat grinder. For some context, The Economist reported on July 9th that Russia had already suffered 31,000 casualties since its summer offensive began the previous May. That offensive is now over, and you can likely double that figure for the true cost of what attempting to take Pokrovsk was to Russia during the 4-month campaign. September wasn't any kinder to Russia, and now, as Putin orders yet more assaults against a Ukrainian defense that is even more prepared than it was at the beginning of summer, the story is unlikely to change. More Russian soldiers are heading to the meat grinder. Those stuck in the pockets have no hope because none of those soldiers are going to break Ukraine's lines. For Putin, what's happening in Pokrovsk runs counter to the narrative that he's sharing with Russia's people. Now Putin has a problem. The Russian propaganda machine has backstabbed Putin, as several pro-Kremlin voices are declaring that Russia has already lost the war. The narrative inside Russia is changing and Putin can't do a thing about it.
The Baltic Sea is important to Russia in many ways. Russia, by way of the Kaliningrad exclave, uses it to intimidate NATO with hybrid warfare tactics. The Baltic Sea is also an important transit route for Russia's Shadow Fleet ships, as well as being what is now referred to as a NATO lake in which Russia needs to maintain a presence. However, the Baltic Sea represents something else to Russia, a route to the emerging Arctic front that Vladimir Putin hopes to dominate in the coming years. The US isn't going to allow that domination to happen. US submarine hunters are now swarming Russia's border and the Baltic Sea, leaving Putin's Arctic front exposed. Newsweek broke the news on September 30 with a report that detailed how the US has deployed several military aircraft to Norway. That alone wouldn't be huge news. Norway is a NATO member, and it's not unusual for aircraft to be deployed there and elsewhere throughout the Nordic and Baltic regions. But what makes this deployment special is the type of aircraft the US has sent. These planes aren't yet more fighter jets NATO can use to deter Russia's drone and jet incursions. The US has sent an aircraft that's capable of hunting submarines and spying on enemies in and around the Baltic Sea. That aircraft is the US Navy P-8 Poseidon. And it looks like the US has sent several of them to watch Russia's borders and thwart Putin's plans for the Baltic Sea and the Arctic. The Kyiv Independent provides the basic details about this aircraft's capabilities, reporting that it's used for both anti-submarine warfare and surface vessel observation and intelligence gathering. Remember the mention of Russia's shadow fleet in the introduction to this video? The P-8 Poseidon is the perfect aircraft for identifying and tracking vessels in that fleet, making them less useful to Russia in the process. The US Naval Academy, or USNA, offers more information. It says that the P-8 Poseidon is a modified Boeing 737-800 ERX that combines reliability with a turbofan jet to offer speed and strength in the same package. The P-8 is also modular, as it features an open mission system architecture that allows the US to adjust and expand its loadout and systems depending on the type of mission in which it takes part. Surveillance is the P-8's main function, and it's equipped with plenty of tools for that particular job. Among them are an array of sensors, including both active multi-static and passive acoustic sensor systems that it can use to detect submarines. Infrared sensors are also installed in the aircraft, as is a digital magnetic anomaly detector. In short, the P-8 has everything that it needs to wait and watch what's happening below, with this array of sensors allowing it to zone in on anything that's different from the norm. The aircraft is also handy in a fight, though such fights would typically see it taking on ships and submarines rather than fighter jets and attack types. USNA says that the P-8 has an internal 5-station weapons bay, in addition to 4-wing pylons and 2 centerline pylons that can be used to support weapons. As with the surveillance gear, these weapons vary depending on the mission. The P-8 can be loaded with mines, torpedoes, bombs and cruise missiles, all of which are supported by a digital stores management system. The UK's Royal Navy, which also operates the aircraft, offers a few more details. It notes that the P-8's twin CFM 56-7 jet engines can generate 27,000 pounds of force each, giving the aircraft a maximum speed of about 563 miles per hour. Of course, that's not impressive when stacked up against fighter jets that can break the sound barrier. But for an aircraft the size of the P-8, it's more than fast enough to allow it to navigate large areas in short amounts of time. Perfect for patrolling the Baltic Sea, for instance. The P-8 can also reach a maximum altitude of 41,000 feet, allowing it to surveil without being visible to the naked eye from a Russian ship. And if it does happen to be caught and attacked, the P-8 has several defenses. These include a missile approach warning system, and both infrared countermeasures and a dedicated countermeasure dispenser. Oh, and the aircraft can also be loaded with 129 sonar buoys that it can drop into a sea or ocean to aid in submarine detection. The P-8 is a very impressive aircraft with capabilities that make it a nightmare for Russian ships. And now, the US is sending several to Norway so they can operate in the Baltic Sea and close to the Arctic, right on Russia's border. How many is the obvious question. The OSINT Technical X account may have the answer, as it's tracked flight data that confirms US P-8s have arrived at the military terminal of Norway's Gardermoen airport. Either 2 or 3 P-8s touched down at the base on September 23, the X account says. And worse yet for Russia, those aircraft aren't sitting idle. They're already flying in regions where Russia doesn't want this type of surveillance plane operating. US Navy P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft continue to loiter off the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad tonight, OSINT Technical reports. Multiple P-8s have deployed to Oslo in recent days, just a short flying time to the newly drone-plagued Baltic region. Newsweek adds that at least one of the P-8s has patrolled the Baltic Sea, travelling right up to the coast of Kaliningrad. It isn't clear whether that flight actually involved violating Russian airspace, as several Russian drones and fighter jets have done to NATO over the last few weeks. But even if the P-8 stayed far enough away from Kaliningrad to ensure Russia can't complain of an incursion, the very presence of this plane in the Baltic Sea can only mean bad things for Putin. It shows Russia that NATO is watching. And now that NATO is watching, it's going to be waiting for Russia to make a mistake, with anything from a ship that's in its shadow fleet to the submarines that may be patrolling the Baltic waters unseen. Worse still for Russia, the fact that these aircraft come from the US shows Putin that whatever hold he might have thought he had over US President Donald Trump doesn't exist anymore. In truth, It hasn't for a while. The arrival of P-8s to the Baltic is just one of several measures the US has taken over the last couple of months to strengthen NATO's defensive posture against Russia in the region. For instance, August 1st saw Trump get so frustrated with Putin and his cronies that he announced the deployment of a pair of nuclear submarines to the Baltic waters. That move came in response to remarks by Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Medvedev, who railed against Trump's threat to impose tariffs against any country that buys oil from Russia. Each new ultimatum is a threat and step towards war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't go down the Sleepy Joe road, Medvedev posted to X on July 28. Whether it was the threat or the Sleepy Joe wisecrack that pushed Trump into action, the US president was quick to respond. Trump took to his Truth Social platform a couple of days later to announce that nuclear submarines would be the response to Medvedev's words. Based on the highly provocative statements of the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, I've ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions, just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that, Trump declared. All of this may seem like a tit-for-tat game between the US and Russia. However, that doesn't change the outcome. The appropriate regions Trump mentioned will likely have been either the Baltic or Arctic, which is ideal for NATO. Its collective defensive posture was increased by the deployment of these subs that, for all anyone knows, might still be prowling beneath the waves of the Baltic Sea. About a month later, the US also sent a carrier group toward the Arctic to take part in a joint military training exercise with Norwegian forces. This deployment saw the US carrier group enter the Barents Sea, which Newsweek points out is part of the Arctic Ocean and, more importantly, lies off the coasts of both Norway and Russia. The deployment included the USS Mahan and the USS Bainbridge, which are both Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that have been assigned to the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier in the past. This deployment was temporary. The ships left the Barents Sea following the training exercise. Still, they served as yet another signal from the US that it's both increasingly willing to cooperate with its NATO allies and that it isn't afraid to project power in Putin's direction. Now, with P-8s arriving in Norway, that message has been carved into stone. The US isn't going to allow Russia to do whatever it wants in a sea that's often referred to as a NATO lake. And now, NATO is going to be able to watch everything that Russia does in the Baltic Sea and by extension the Arctic, both above and below the waves. The submarine hunters are on Russia's border, and they're active. This means several things for Putin and both his Baltic and Arctic ambitions, starting with the obvious. 2 or 3 P-8s in Norway is massive for NATO's air policing mission in the Baltic Sea. Separate from this latest deployment, the US has been taking part in that mission for quite some time. Back in July, Newsweek reports another P-8 deployed to Iceland's Keflavik Air Base, from where it participated in a NATO mission dubbed Baltic Sentry. The odds are high that this latest deployment of P-8s is going to be doing something similar in terms of helping NATO forces to counteract Russia's attempts to destabilize the Baltic region with its hybrid warfare tactics. That's the entire point of NATO's air policing, which the organization describes as a peacetime mission that aims to preserve the security of Allied skies. It's a collective task and involves the continuous presence, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, of fighter aircraft and crews which are ready to react quickly to possible airspace violations. P-8s aren't going to serve as part of the response teams for these sorts of incidents. They're not built to take on fighter jets. However, they will add to what amounts to an early warning system for NATO's aerial police, in addition to being capable of keeping track of Russian ships and submarines that NATO naval forces may have to take on. This sort of strengthened presence in the Baltic and across NATO's eastern flank is vital. Russia has been getting up to a lot of shady things throughout September. Drone and fighter jet incursions into NATO airspace appear to have become a common tactic for Russia during the last month or so. Euronews reports that at least 10 European countries have experienced these kinds of incursions over the last couple of months, with many having taken place during September. Russia sending 19 drones into Poland grabbed all of the headlines, but Russia has pulled similar tricks against Romania, Germany, Denmark, and France in recent weeks. P-8s aren't made to fight against drones. They're not even built to spot them, though they could probably serve that purpose if needed. These two statements may make one wonder what Russia's drone incursions have to do with the P-8s arriving in Norway. It all comes down to Russia's shadow fleet. Recently, Ukraine revealed that this fleet, which most thought Russia used solely to skirt Western oil sanctions, has taken on a much more nefarious purpose. These ships are being used to launch the very drones that are now entering European airspace. Find out more about Ukraine's claims in our in-depth video covering this major issue. As for P-8s, they may not do much about drones, but they can locate shadow fleet ships. That alone makes them a valuable tool against Russia's new drone strategy, as P-8s may be capable of proving not only that shadow fleet ships are sailing through the Baltic, but also that Russia is using these ships for its drone attacks. Then there are the submarines. Tracking Russia's undersea vessels in the Baltic may be the primary reason why the US has sent P-8s to Norway. However, there are questions around just how many submarines these aircraft will be looking for. At one point in time, Russia's Baltic fleet had a massive number of submarines. During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union maintained around 130 submarines that all operated as part of the Baltic fleet. Those days are long gone, the Carnegie Endowment points out. Now, Russia operates just a single diesel-electric attack submarine as part of its Baltic fleet, which begs the question of why up to 3 P-8s have gone to Norway. For one, it's perhaps more accurate to say that Russia operates one known submarine in the Baltic Sea. There may be others. Tackling the shadow fleet is another reason why these planes have been deployed to Norway, as is strengthening NATO's defensive posture, as was just covered. However, another reason that P-8s have arrived in Norway is that NATO isn't just concerned about what Russia is doing in the Baltic Sea. Another potential front is on its agenda, and it's one that Russia has placed a lot of focus on over the last few years: the Arctic. Norway is very much a part of the Arctic, at least some of it is. The Arctic Circle runs directly through Nordland County, which is in the north of Norway. This gives Norway a direct interest in what happens in the Arctic, and due to Norway being a NATO nation, it also gives NATO a direct interest. Furthermore, the Baltic Sea is connected to the Arctic via the White Sea-Baltic Canal. That canal was built by Russia and has been operating since 1933, which essentially means that Russia has built its own connection between two regions in which it has interests of its own. It's tempting to see what happens in the Baltic as being focused solely on Eastern and Northern Europe. The reality is that anything that America P-8s find in the Baltic could also end up in the Arctic, and vice versa. It's also in the Arctic where a P-8 submarine hunting capabilities are going to come in very handy. According to the Network for Strategic Analysis, the Russian Northern Fleet is the primary naval force operating in the Arctic. Submarines are a huge part of that fleet, to the point where the fleet has more subs than it does surface ships. There are around 25 submarines to 20 surface ships in the Russian Northern Fleet, and that creates an obvious problem for NATO. Of course, NATO wants to know what these submarines are getting up to in Arctic waters. However, the existence of the canal mentioned earlier means that it's also possible that Russia is sending submarines from the Arctic to the Baltic Sea undetected. If that's happening, NATO wants to know about it. The new P-8s in Norway will ensure that it does. Returning to the Arctic specifically, Russia has made no secret of its desire to exploit that region. Climate change and the melting of Arctic ice are slowly unveiling new shipping routes through the Arctic, in addition to possibly providing access to natural resources that Russia would love to control. The Atlantic Council explained more in an April article, where it said that gaining control over the Arctic's northern sea route is so critical to the Kremlin's plans that Putin has prioritized building a militarized presence in the region. Moscow sees the northern sea route as part of Russia's national transport infrastructure and has sought to control access for shipping from other nations, the council adds, which sheds light on what Russia really wants to do: take control over Arctic shipping. With the Northern Sea route being so vast, Russia can't legitimately claim that the entire route is part of its territorial waters, so it's militarizing. It's trying to use its submarines to intimidate any other nation that might mount a challenge to Russia's Arctic ambitions. The US, which has its own Arctic interests alongside Canada and Norway, may be using its P-8s to make the challenge that Putin had hoped would never come. If nothing else, NATO will get a better idea what Russia's submarines actually do in the Arctic region. That, coupled with the Baltic mission, may be enough. Having said that, something mentioned much earlier in the video remains relevant. OSINT Technical tracked the first P-8 sortie to the outskirts of the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Sandwiched between Poland and the Baltic states, Kaliningrad is yet another Russian threat that NATO wants to keep an eye on. Kaliningrad certainly has strategic importance due to this positioning alone. It offers Russia more access to the Baltic Sea for one, which ties back into the points made earlier about the benefits of a P-8 presence in the Baltic. Beyond that, this small territory, which the US Naval Institute says measures just 5,800 square miles, is believed to be home to several of Russia's tactical Iskander missiles. Those missiles have a range of 310 miles and are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. So any surveillance offering information about what is and isn't happening with those missiles will be helpful to NATO. The P-8s now in Norway may be able to provide such intelligence. At the very least, the US planes will be able to track vessels sailing in and out of Kaliningrad, which in turn might provide information on what precisely Russia is sending to its exclave. The US has concerns about Kaliningrad, just as it does about the Arctic and the Baltic Sea. Those concerns manifested as a veiled threat in July when the commander of US Army Europe and Africa, General Chris Donahue, let Russia know what he believes NATO forces could take Kaliningrad in a time frame that's unheard of. Russia's exclave is one of the most militarized regions in Europe, the Kyiv Independent says. It's also the origin of a host of electronic warfare tactics, most of which revolve around GPS spoofing and jamming, that have affected ships and aircraft in the Baltic region ever since Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. P-8s keeping eyes on Kaliningrad can be classed as an extension of what's likely their main mission in the Baltic Sea. The exclave is clearly a priority. If it wasn't, the first P-8 deployment since the aircraft arrived in Norway wouldn't have ended up so close to Kaliningrad's borders. Ultimately, the US P-8s have just strengthened NATO's presence in several key regions, and only time will tell what those aircraft end up doing. The US just made a major power play, changing the face of the Russia-Ukraine war forever. It's decided to share intelligence with Ukraine about long-range targets within Russia, effectively helping Kyiv's forces destroy even more of the Kremlin's infrastructure. It's a bold and decisive move, one that will inevitably trigger a chain reaction with far-reaching ramifications, and it might in the end be the move that crushes Russia once and for all. Here's a full breakdown of what happened and what it means moving forward. On October 1st, reports from numerous media outlets, including Reuters and the Wall Street Journal, confirmed that the US government has authorized its intelligence agencies, as well as the Pentagon, to help Ukraine target and take out Russian energy infrastructure locations. Insider officials revealed that Kyiv will receive US intelligence about Russia's oil refineries, pipelines, and power stations far beyond the borders with Ukraine. In other words, America is about to make it dramatically easier for Ukraine to launch its drones and missiles at the core pieces that power Russia's energy industry and prop up its economy. The enormity of this decision cannot be overstated. Those who have been following the war closely will already know how Ukraine has been regularly targeting Russian energy infrastructure in recent weeks and months. On numerous occasions, reports have revealed how Ukraine's long-range drone attacks have dealt damage to Russia's oil refineries, pipelines, fuel depots, and storage facilities. It's taken time for Russia to feel the effects, and Ukraine has had to be patient, picking and choosing its targets with care and carrying out its plans to perfection, choosing the right times and the right locations to strike in order to deal maximum damage, all while withstanding regular frontline assaults and nightly bombardments from its enemies. But the impact of Kyiv strikes is finally being felt in a major way. Recent statistics from September 28 show that around 38% of Russia's oil refining capacity has been taken offline thanks to Ukraine's drone attacks. That's the equivalent of around 338,000 tons of oil a day, with gasoline output dropping by 1 million tons in total. And around 70% of that, or 236,000 tons a day, is a direct result of Ukrainian drone strikes, according to analytics agency Ciala. Now, Russia's domestic fuel market no longer has enough supply to meet demand. In fact, it's about 20% short of meeting the country's needs, and the Russian people are feeling the heat. In an increasing number of regions around the country, shortages are being reported and prices are skyrocketing, with some members of the public even having to turn to black market suppliers just to get the fuel they need to survive. According to Russian economist Vladislav Inozemtsev, more than 300 independent fuel retailers have been forced to shut down since May as a direct result of Ukraine's actions. Others are being forced to take drastic measures to remain open, like limiting consumers to small amounts of fuel per purchase, banning people from filling up gas cans, or even restricting access to loyal card-holding customers only. And this crisis is only getting worse as the days go by. Indeed, the latest reports from Russia reveal that Moscow is now preparing to impose restrictions on diesel exports, following the gasoline export ban imposed earlier this year. Supply issues are also increasing, with even major cities like Nizhny Novgorod, the sixth biggest city in Russia, suffering the effects. In certain locations, drivers are having to wait in lines that are more than 100 cars long, with some forced to queue up overnight so they have the fuel they need to get to work and back the next day. And this isn't just affecting Russia's western regions or occupied territories of Ukraine. Even in the Far East, literally thousands of miles from the front lines of the conflict, Russian citizens are finding fuel increasingly hard to acquire, and a local governor, Alexei Maslov, has issued an urgent call for people to stop panic buying. This fuel crisis doesn't just affect everyday people either. It has a direct impact on the Kremlin's war machine too, making it much more difficult for Russia to transport troops and supplies from place to place and keep its military logistics flowing smoothly. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, confirmed this on September 25, stating, "The capabilities of the enemy's military-industrial complex have been significantly reduced. We can see this on the battlefield. This is a fuel crisis in Russia, which directly affects logistics and the supply of its army." Even on the Russian side, staunch Kremlin supporters and nationalist figures can no longer hide from the harsh reality of the situation. Maxim Kalishnikov, a well-known propagandist, recently admitted, "I can state that the situation is deteriorating. The fuel crisis is developing now. The voices of those who say that they have to switch to ration consumption using coupons, basically fuel cards, are becoming louder and louder." Meanwhile, at the highest level, in the halls of the Kremlin itself, government officials are scrambling to find solutions to the problem. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak has been working on plans to waive import duties on fuel from Asian nations like China and South Korea, as well as reintroducing an octane-boosting additive that was actually banned in 2016 in a desperate attempt to stretch the domestic supply. Russia is also banking on Belarus to provide additional fuel imports in the coming days and weeks to make up for its production problems, and purchases from Belarus are already up to 36% compared to the previous year. Kremlin officials also continue to tell the public that everything is fine, with Novak recently claiming that the situation is under control. But the facts and stats of the situation paint a very different picture, and the Russian people aren't blind. They may face Kremlin-led propaganda on their TVs and the increasingly limited array of websites they're allowed to visit, but they can also see with their own eyes that the prices of fuel and other everyday essential goods are rising by the day, and that their country's economy is growing weaker and weaker, and it's not set to improve anytime soon. Indeed, Russia's finance ministry has recently proposed increasing value-added tax (VAT) from 20 to 22% in 2026 in order to generate an estimated 1.3 trillion rubles or $15.5 billion each year. Officials feel that this is a necessary step to help make up some of Russia's massive federal budget deficit, which reached a staggering 4.88 trillion rubles or $61.1 billion between January and July of this year. However, the fact of the matter is that even if Russia does find a few short-term fixes for its financial and fuel problems, it's not going to be able to magically undo all of this damage to its economy and energy industry. It faces major problems at a deep structural level, and it's all thanks to Ukraine's sound strategic decisions to find and take out the targets that matter the most. And Ukraine has done all of that more or less on its own. Of course, it's had plenty of support from Western allies, but it's had to use its own intelligence and its own resources to identify Russia's energy infrastructure targets and plan attacks on those targets, most often using its own domestic drones to deal the damage. Despite having to deal with almost constant Russian drone and missile attacks, as well as digging in along the front lines to keep Kremlin troops out of important locations like the Donetsk city of Pokrovsk, Ukraine's forces have somehow found the time and capacity to dismantle Russia's oil industry. According to the Kyiv Post, there were at least 21 attacks on Russian oil refineries between August 1st and September 19, with some of those facilities struck twice or even 3 times in that relatively brief span of time. September alone saw 4 major facilities hit, including the Kirishi's Kinef plant in the Leningrad region, which is the second biggest refinery in all of Russia, plus the Rosneft Ryazan refinery, which is one of the top 5 largest of its kind. Both of those facilities had to shut down in the wake of Ukraine's attacks. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, summed up how important it is to keep hitting the Russian oil industry, stating, "The most effective sanctions, the ones that work the fastest, are the fires at Russia's oil refineries, its terminals, oil depots. We've significantly restricted Russia's oil industry, and this significantly restricts the war." Now, just imagine how much more effective Ukraine could be and how much more damage it could deal to Russian oil with US intelligence on its side. After all, the United States does not only boast the strongest military force in the world by far, but also leads the way when it comes to intelligence. It has the means and experience to gather intel in the most effective, efficient, and precise ways possible, and this has given it an all-important advantage when carrying out countless military missions in the past. Ukraine has already benefited from US intelligence in the war so far, but America has only provided intel in relation to battlefield situational awareness within Ukraine's borders in contested territories like Donetsk and Luhansk. It hasn't yet given Kyiv any data about locations within Russia, but that's all about to change, and one official told the Wall Street Journal that agencies are now just waiting for the final written approval from the White House before releasing data to the Ukrainian military. That approval could come at any time, meaning that Ukraine could be just days or even hours away from receiving its biggest intelligence boost of the war so far. And that's not all. The US is also said to be urging NATO allies to follow its example and share their own intelligence with Kyiv too. All of a sudden, Ukrainian forces might find themselves with massive amounts of new, valuable information about key targets deep in Russian territory. At that point, the tide of battle will inevitably turn in Ukraine's favor. With fresh intelligence, Ukraine's forces should become even more efficient and even deadlier when it comes to picking their targets, planning attacks, and executing their strategies. They could wipe countless more oil and fuel-related targets off the map, crippling the energy industry even further, worsening the fuel shortages, and quite literally setting Russia on fire, leaving the Kremlin in a state of chaos and catastrophe with no answers and no way out. Russia, meanwhile, which has already shown major frailty and struggled to repel Ukraine's drones so far, would inevitably have an even harder time predicting Kyiv's moves and taking the necessary actions to safeguard its energy infrastructure if it has to counterattack not just Ukrainian intelligence but US and NATO intel as well. This move should also strike fear into the heart of Vladimir Putin himself, because it's the biggest sign yet that the US, under President Trump, has massively shifted its stance on the war. Prior to this point, Trump had mainly wanted to focus on ending the war through diplomatic negotiations, meeting with both Putin and Zelensky, and attempting to broker a deal in which Ukraine ceded some of its territories. He spoke about Russia keeping hold of Crimea, for example, and argued that Ukraine would need to sacrifice other regions, such as Donetsk and Luhansk, in order to stop the conflict. In recent weeks, however, everything has changed. Trump is said to have grown increasingly angry and frustrated with Putin, and is now distancing himself from the Russian leader, preferring instead to pledge his support to Ukraine. Early in September, the administration approved a major weapons and aid package for Kyiv, which was to be funded by NATO nations. Then on September 23, Trump dropped a bombshell on his social media site, Truth Social, stating that Ukraine could recover all of the land lost to Russia over the course of the war so far. After getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it's causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. The US president went on to call Russia a paper tiger in his post, criticizing the country for fighting aimlessly and pledging further US support for NATO and Ukraine. With Trump now willing to share intelligence with Kyiv too, it appears he's tired of talking and ready to take bold, significant steps towards ending this war by whatever means necessary. There's just one problem. Even with US intelligence on its side, Ukraine still needs the necessary weapons to carry out long-range deep strikes on Russian infrastructure. Its drones have proven effective to a point, but it can't necessarily deal the kind of serious lasting damage that will truly bring the Kremlin to its knees. It also still has to cope with restrictions and limitations about how it uses some of the weapons supplied by its Western allies. The US, for example, demands that Ukrainian forces request approval every time they want to fire an ATACMS missile at a Russian target, and new deliveries of ATACMS have been blocked for some time. Ukraine also lacks the sort of missiles it needs to strike targets that are hundreds of miles beyond its borders, since its ally-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadows can only go so far. However, that too may be about to change, because the US isn't just gearing up to share intelligence with Ukraine, it's also considering supplying Kyiv with some of the most powerful cruise missiles known to man, Tomahawks. Famed for their remarkable range, Tomahawk missiles can travel distances of up to 1,000 miles to strike their targets. While Ukraine is working on its long-range missiles like the Flamingo and Long Neptune, it doesn't yet have the infrastructure in place to produce them in large quantities, so cannot currently plan too many deep strikes on Russian soil. If it suddenly received a big batch of Tomahawks, however, it could instantly get to work identifying important energy targets hundreds of miles into Russia, including those in the Moscow area and beyond, and take them out with staggering precision and immense firepower. Because Tomahawks don't just have amazing range, they're incredibly agile too, capable of reaching peak speeds of around 570 miles an hour and carrying out evasive maneuvers in the air to avoid enemy interceptors. Following low-altitude flight paths to avoid detection by enemy radars and air defense systems, they're remarkably effective at hitting their targets, and each one has the capacity to carry high-explosive warheads weighing up to 1,000 pounds. So, when these missiles make impact, they have the power to turn entire structures into nothing but dust and rubble. Airfields, ammo depots, oil refineries, fuel storage facilities, all of these types of targets have no way of withstanding a direct strike from a Tomahawk missile, and there's years of evidence to back that up, since Tomahawks have been used by the US in conflicts dating back to the early 1990s. They've taken out countless targets in countries like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Syria. And very soon, the same may happen in Russia, with US Vice President J.D. Vance telling Fox News in a September 28 interview,
"It's something the president's going to make the final determination on. What the president is going to do is what's in the best interest of the United States of America."
Vance later added,
"I know that we're having conversations this very minute about that issue."
While no final decision has yet been made, it's clear that the US is strongly considering providing Kyiv with Tomahawks or perhaps Barracuda missiles, which also boast impressive subsonic flight speeds and extended ranges of up to 580 miles. Germany too has pledged more long-range weapon support to Ukraine, and once Kyiv gets its hands on these weapons, with American intelligence to guide them, its forces will be almost unstoppable. Fully armed and fully informed, they'll have everything they need to hit Russia where it hurts most, striking the most valuable, important locations, taking out one piece of energy infrastructure after another, and from that point on, a whole chain reaction of events is likely to take place. More attacks will occur on energy locations across Russia, which will cause oil production capacities to decrease even more. This should have knock-on effects on both the economy, which will weaken further, and the Russian public, who will see their quality of life and spending power diminish. Resentment and frustration towards the Kremlin will inevitably increase as the people seek someone to blame, and eventually even the oligarchs and nationalists who have stood by Putin all this time may decide that enough is enough, turning on the president at long last. At that point, even Putin, who's made so many bold proclamations about Ukraine belonging to Russia and shown almost no real inclination to stop the war, may be forced to admit defeat and sit down at the negotiating table to bring this bloody battle to an end. Now, learn more about the possibility of US Tomahawk missiles being sent to Ukraine in our recent video, detailing the incredible technical specifications and proven track record of these weapons in action. Or to get a better idea of how difficult life is getting for Putin, check out this video detailing how even some of the Kremlin's biggest supporters and pro-Putin nationalists have slowly but surely started to turn on their president. And finally, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications too, so you can be among the first in the world to find out about the latest big news and developments from this war and other major military conflicts worldwide.